Hi, welcome to the Sifu Mimi Chan Show. Thanks for joining the conversation. In this episode, I speak with Mei Lee, who is an award-winning broadcast journalist, host of The Mei Lee Show, adjunct professor at USC, and founder of Lotus Media House. She has been both a US-based and international anchor, host, correspondent, and producer. It was a pleasure to speak to Mei as a fellow podcaster and AAPI activist. Mei has been very outspoken about the rise of anti-Asian hate crimes since the start of the pandemic and spotlighted many of the victims of these horrible events. You can check out her podcast and social media to learn more. I'm loving these conversations and hope you are too. If you are, please rate my podcast on your platform of choice and share it with others. If you would like to support with a donation to help keep this podcast going, you can become a patron of the show by visiting my website or patreon.com/SifuMimiChan. For comments or suggestions, reach out on social media at SifuMimiChan. Now, on with the show. Hello, Mei. Thank you so much for joining me on my podcast today.
I'm so glad to be here. Thanks, Mimi.
Oh my goodness. Well, the honor is all mine. Off air, we were speaking a bit, and I of course follow you and see all the amazing work you're doing. And it's always nice to have a fellow podcaster on, but you are not just a podcaster, you're a journalist and you have such an extensive resume of work. I'm really excited to actually talk to you and, a little fangirl. It's just kind of an honor to be able to speak with someone whose work I admire so much. So.
Oh, well, thank you. I mean, yeah, I have a pretty long history, which is just another way of saying I'm old. So there you go.
Not at all. So I would actually love for our listeners to kind of get to know you a little bit and a little bit about kind of your background and how you're raised and kind of what led you into journalism. Because I know it's just, as a fellow Asian American who grew up in the States, just we all have just an impacting story to share. And so I'd love to hear a little bit about like where you grew up and, what that was like for you.
Yeah, I grew up in Ohio, in the Midwest, in the 70s. So you can imagine what that was like back then. And so what brought my family to Ohio was my father was a doctor. So he was getting trained at different universities. One of them was Ohio State University, where I was born. And then we kind of moved around a little bit, moved back to Korea for a few years, actually, when I was very, very young. So Korean was actually my first learned language. And then we moved back to the States when I was about 4. Okay. And so, at that young age, I entered, preschool and kindergarten. And so, again, we went back to Ohio and, it was challenging, right? To put a kind term towards that, because I was the only Asian kid, and I probably was the only kid of person of color in the school at the time. So a lot of teasing, a lot of bullying, a lot of otherizing. But when you're that young, you have no idea what's going on. You don't have a name for it. You just know that you're not being treated the same way, and you're different. Right. So I grew up with that. So I am very, very familiar with what's going on now, especially with all the racism and xenophobia. Yeah. But, when it came to choosing my career, I thought I was your typical Asian kid back then, where I thought I should be a症or a lawyer or something like that. And so I struggled through science and math my entire academic career. Up until college, I thought I was going to be a doctor, even though I sucked at science and math. So I was definitely barking up the wrong tree. And I think that's another example of programming where we're told to be a certain thing and we have to fit this category. And that comes from internal, sort of within our culture, but also external, where the outside world thinks Asians, oh my gosh, we're so smart. We're so good at science and math. So this is who we are. So all of that programming, as I got older, I realized, wow, we're all sort of victims of this kind of programming inside and out. So I went against the grain. I realized I couldn't do science and math. And I asked myself, what is it that I actually really like to do? And it was writing. It was public speaking. It was the visual media. And a voice, and I like to say it was the voice of God, said, you know what, May, you need to be a broadcast journalist. And so from that moment on, I was a sophomore in college. I focused on that, and the rest is history.
Yeah, well, that is so remarkable, and I love that you kind of describe yourself as going against the grain, because it is, such a part of our culture to not go against the grain. But I feel like that shift is certainly happening, and especially in these last several years, and of course for people like yourself that have led the way and have taken us outside of what is the stereotype. And, kind of going back to that childhood, I grew up in Orlando, Florida, which was also not very diverse at the time. And so I definitely echo a lot of what you must have felt. But English was my first language. So, going into school, because my husband is, Hispanic. So his first language was Spanish. And so he's like, I don't know. My parents said, you'll learn school in English. And it was kind of probably a little bit of the same for you, where you kind of had to adapt and learn. And I find it interesting because we've been having a lot of these conversations where one of the big concerns for the AAPI community right now is for the children and our youth and what's happening in schools. And, there was, of course, the tragic incidents in New Jersey with a couple of kids who were bullied so much that they actually committed suicide. And people really don't realize that, yes, for the most part, us as kids, we've heard everything from making fun of your name to what lunch you eat. I'm sure you and I could put it together, a long list of horrible things that people say as children.
Definitely.
Right. But and every child is so different. So while, you had mentioned, as a kid, you just kind of go, okay, well, that's not nice and everything, but kids can be cruel. You don't really see it as racism, right? Until you're older and you reflect and you go, wow, this was traumatic. But we are seeing kids now who, maybe because it's so well defined in our society of like, what is racism and understanding more about it. Do you feel like kids now maybe would take it differently? Or do you think it's generational?
Yeah, I think the younger generation has become more aware, just because it's become, unfortunately, it's 2022, but racism has become even more overt and uncovered a lot more. But what I see, and I'm also an adjunct professor at USC, so I teach undergrad and graduate students. And what I see still, and it disappoints me, is that they still have identity issues and they still struggle with this kind of question of who they are and where they belong. And even though they know they're Asian American and they know, that's their background and they're very aware of it, there's still this, again, programming, societal programming of who you're supposed to be and the stereotypes that are, misleading or outright wrong. And so there's still this struggle that happens internally. And, the statistics are that Asian kids, youth, commit suicide twice as much as other communities, kids from other communities. That's alarming. That should tell us something's very wrong and something is happening where maybe feelings and emotions are being internalized, and the pressure of society and partly culture for sure, but also society and now what's happening. I think it's a real problem that people still aren't willing to face or, figure out how to solve. And this is pervasive. And of course, COVID didn't help, overall.
No. Yeah. We obviously saw, I think this is something that I've found really interesting, because as COVID hit and we started to see all of these, the rise in the anti-Asian hate crimes, and you and I discussing just even the last few minutes know that this all existed before the pandemic. We're unfortunately just being able to see it now, right? And but it's not necessarily unfortunate. It is unfortunate, but it's kind of important that it's brought out into the light, into the mainstream media, because I think people are under the impression that Asians aren't discriminated against because we're business owners, and there's all those myths that we're the quote unquote more successful people of color and in the BIPOC community, and we it's so hard to break that mold. And like you're saying, these statistics of youth having the tendency towards suicide being so immense. When you're as a teacher, I guess at USC, how how do you kind of speak to that? Or do students, talk to you about this? And what is it kind of you give them in terms of advice? Because like everyone has to kind of come into their own, right? And finally embrace. Yeah. I'll admit, when I was in school, I wished I was like, quote unquote, everyone else, right? As a young child, you just want to feel like you belong. And of course, now I am all in with my Asian heritage and culture, but that takes a while. And I speak to a lot of people that say it wasn't until college they finally started to embrace that. And it's like, so what do you kind of give as advice, but also how can we help younger kids not have to wait until they're in college to identify?
Well, I think first and foremost, it's exactly what I did just last year, which is I realized that one of the biggest problems that we have in this country is that there is a lack of education when it comes to Asian American history and background and identity. So in schools, whoever learned about the Chinese Exclusion Act or, barely about Japanese incarceration during World War II or the Page Act or the lynchings that took place in Wyoming, none of that was ever taught in school. So therefore, there's a total lack of understanding of what the Asian American experience is in this country.
Yeah.
There's a total lack of awareness that we have been here for hundreds of years and have been persecuted and oppressed and victimized. So it's not this one-dimensional story of like, oh, these new immigrants who came and they're so rich and they're so crazy and they're so educated. Well, we have the biggest gap, economic gap of any community from rich to poor. Educationally too, huge gap. So these are things that the average person never understands because you can't blame them. If it's never taught in schools, how are they supposed to know? I use this as a parallel. Slavery, the Civil War, that was taught in school. That's part of American history. So therefore, we have an understanding of the Black American experience. The Holocaust, World War II, the persecution of Jews, that is taught in school. So therefore, we have an understanding of that. If you don't teach it from a young age, how do you expect young people to grow up to even have any understanding and awareness and therefore empathy? So there's a lack of empathy, whereas maybe with other communities, there's at least some empathy for that community because of the understanding of the history and background. So it's got to start with education for sure, in schools, in communities, in businesses, all of that across the board because there's so little understanding. So I started a course last year at USC that was fast-tracked. It's called The Evolution of Asian Americans and the Media, because I wanted to shape these journalists, these future journalists, into understanding what the history was and how media misled the public perception and how these stereotypes were created. So I think that's a big one. We're starting to see that though, in Illinois and New Jersey, right?
Yeah. And so I'm not sure you're aware, but I'm the state lead for Make Us Visible Florida. And so our bill just got shot down to include AAPI history in K through 12 education. So that's something that I've been working on for the last year, which I started last year, kind of getting that going. We got a bill. We went all the way. We went to the first committee in the Senate and it did really well. But this is something that I definitely see kind of as a stepping stone. And as I'm a martial arts teacher by trade, so that's actually a sort of an educator of sorts, right? So it was just something I saw in the community that was lacking. And like you said, I didn't get to learn about these things in school. And I am with you. Like, I feel like education is the key and the long-term solution to preventative measures. And so it's definitely going to be a struggle. And it was exciting. And I am in touch with, of course, the Illinois, New Jersey, and all the teams that have been doing this and doing their work. But Florida is going to be a bit more of a challenge. Unfortunately.
But good for you for trying. Seriously, that's pretty amazing that you got that far. So
yes, we're not done. It's been it's ironic that we're speaking today. It's just literally just been like a week or so in learning the news that we're not going to keep going through the agenda, and so our bill is quote unquote dead, but our movement is very much alive. And so we are definitely going to write another bill, and we're definitely definitely going to do this and keep going forward. So I am so grateful that there are people that like you that are pushing that agenda, even at a collegiate level, even in the media and doing your podcast and your broadcast, because the more everybody starts to see that this is an issue, but also that it's something that does need to be talked about, so that empathy is going to be helping these kids. It's a matter of public safety. So I think it's amazing that, and I love that in college you can kind of do that. You can like, oh, you know what, we're going to have a course, and then there's a course. But
well, I'll tell you something.
What was that challenge like?
Yeah, I don't think this would have been as easy had all of this crap not started up, right? So I think USC, like many, educational institutions, realized that, this was a time of reckoning that was going on. And so therefore, I think they were much more receptive than they would have been, if I had been, pitched this 5 years ago, I don't think they would have fast tracked the course like this, but they fast tracked it for me because they knew that it was so essential and that it was pretty urgent. So I was lucky in terms of timing but I have to give myself some credit. I was smart knowing that I had to strike when the iron was hot.
Exactly.
And so we know how this works. We know that as a society, people have a very short attention span. They start losing interest and they go back to business as usual. And we know that's what's happening right now too. Yeah. Even with all the anti-Asian hate crimes that are taking place almost on a daily basis. Yeah. Mainstream media has moved on. The public thinks it's over. Everybody thinks, what do you mean? It's still going on? What are you talking about?
Right.
The horror and these murders of, Christina Lee and Michelle Go. Again, everyone was like, oh my God, how could this happen? Well, people, this has been happening throughout. It's just, you don't pay attention. You're not paying attention.
Exactly.
So it's frustrating.
It's frustrating. And I think I love that you are trying to kind of get to the root of it with teaching journalists what and how to cover things, from a, clearer eye, because honestly, that is the problem, right? We as, consumers of information, in general, I will say, are very lazy, right? We're not going to go through a ton of research just to get to the quote unquote truth or to kind of do all that. So it's whatever we get put in front of us. And it's really unfortunate in the last several years, what is put in front of us. It's like actually outraging compared to the real stories that really should be covered, right?
Yeah,
and it's frustrating.
I think part of it is also the lack of representation, right? I mean, yes, good journalists should cover a story, openly and look at all the different angles and the different stories and the different narratives and piece it together. But there's also a level of understanding that needs to happen. And that only can come from people who have that background as well, that representation. So an Asian American journalist is going to cover a story like the Atlanta shootings last year in a little bit of a different way, probably with more depth and understanding of the culture, and why these women and the families weren't willing to talk because it's culturally not appropriate to talk to the media about something so tragic, right? So things like that, that's representation. And when newsrooms have a lack of that representation and understanding, they're never going to cover the story appropriately, or they're going to make stupid mistakes, like calling the activist Grace Lee Michelle Go, on ABC News. So stuff like that is going to continue to happen because they're like, oh yeah, same, well, whatever. So it's the dismissal that I think irritates us even more because it's being made to feel invisible, right? And that's kind of how we've been made to feel and treated for centuries. Yeah.
I mean, and almost like you said, like because of that historic culture that's been put upon us, you almost feel like that's how you should feel. That if you don't feel that way, going against the grain, all of that there's something wrong with you, right? It's really defeating, actually, unless you have people around you to kind of uplift you and tell you like, no, that's not the case.
Right. And I think that's what's good about what's happening. The silver lining of what's happening is that people are becoming much more empowered and finding their voices and then being willing to speak out and push back on this false narrative. Right. Yeah. And this stereotype that's existed. So that's the good thing that's coming out of all of this.
Yeah, I mean, and thank goodness for that, because there's got to be some silver lining. Otherwise, we'd be just in just a deep depression forever, right?
It's so true. It's so
yeah,
true.
yeah. I mean, one of the things that I talk about as well is like, this has been just such a horrible time for the AAPI community. But at the same time, now there's visibility and there's encouragement for people to speak out. And I've seen communities, even just with the bill that I wrote, like people just coming across the state that have never engaged before amongst the Asian community. You know what I mean? So that has been uplifting and very, very exciting. I know you have the Mei Li show and you also have a book, and I'd love to hear a bit more about, that work and, what that's meant to you, and then also the inspiration for your book and what you hope people take away from it.
Well, so let's start with the show. The show started back in February. Well, we launched in February of 2020. Mm-hmm. So it was before COVID became a thing.
Right.
And we had started the show, the concept, months prior, because we were thinking, there's really no sort of media platform that focuses and celebrates AAPIs, and their stories and everything from the celebrities and authors, activists, things like that. So it was really meant to be a show about celebration and, and then and depth of conversation and all of that. So we start the show and we have this lineup of great guests, things like that. We had pre-taped. And then, of course, COVID started growing, and then the xenophobia and the anti-Asian hate started exploding. And so I decided to take that platform and use it, as at least to the best of my ability, to bring attention to what was happening, because early on, nobody really was paying attention. And I think people were afraid to say anything about it because they were afraid that they would be, sort of called out or whatever. For me, I saw it coming. And again, I think this comes from my lived experience of growing up with a lot of racism. I saw it coming. I knew this was going to turn into something much bigger. And so I started warning people, literally. I was just like, this, you need to pay attention to this, because this is going to be a bigger thing. And I was using my platform to try to fight back, and raise awareness. So the show got a different kind of notoriety because of that. And I became this sort of accidental activist, like I like to call myself, without the intention of becoming somebody that was going to fall into this role. So, we've been, I've been focusing on these, issues all along. Yeah. It's been exhausting. It's been depleting. And I recently, on my last episode, I said, I need to take a break, because I felt like I was so drained emotionally, mentally, physically, from doing this for now over 2 years continuously. And so I just was like, I need to take a break. I need to take a hiatus from this, because it's just too much. And so, because I thought to myself, and this is a mental health issue too, you have to recognize when you're getting burnt out or you're taking on too much emotional strain. You're the one who has to recognize it in yourself and take action, or else, it's going to be pretty bad for you. And so that's what I said to myself. I'm like, okay, May, you need to take some action for the time being before you go over the edge and just there's no point of no return. So that's been the show. I'm still obviously very active on social media, because I still want to stay in touch and inform. The book, though, that is actually totally different. That actually is coming out of my academic background. I was asked to write a book about being on the air and, how to do voice work and being on television and being a news anchor, things like that. So that's an academic publication that I'm in the middle of writing. So it doesn't have anything to do with the work that I'm doing with the show and my activism. So yeah.
But that's still, it's still part of you, and it's really exciting and a journey. And not that that's a break, writing a book, but it's a departure of feelings, right? But I mean, that seems like quite an undertaking.
Yeah, I'll tell you, Mimi, I've written a book before. A publisher had come to me in 2008 in Singapore when I was doing my first iteration of the Mei Li show. And back then in Asia, I decided to start a show that represented the empowered woman of Asia, because I saw this trend taking place across the region where women were becoming much more independent, much more vocal, and they needed to express themselves. So I was like, you know what, maybe I'll do a show that's sort of kind of Oprah-esque for the Asian woman. And so this publisher came to me and said, you have such an interesting story of your background and your youth and growing up and becoming a journalist and, fighting racism and all of that. And so can you write a book? So I did. Back then I wrote the book. It was sort of a memoir. So that was challenging in a different way. But you know what? Writing a memoir, believe it or not, to me at least, is easier than what I'm doing right now. The academic publication, it is so tedious. Seriously, I have to meet deadlines every couple of weeks, for my editor. And I'm like, oh my God, I cannot, but I never miss a deadline. That's just how I work. But
I feel you. I feel very common thread with you right now on so many of the things that you're speaking about.
Okay, good.
I definitely feel I haven't done the book route, but I've directed a film and produced a film, and it's tedious. Like I get it. Like I get that you're just like, no, I have to get this done, stay on task, and probably a bit of a perfectionist.
that too. But man, I was just like, don't mark my words. I'm not going to write another academic publication again. I'm sure never say never, but I seriously, every time I'm trying to meet my deadline, I'm like, never again.
Oh, it's one of those trials, but when you're done, it's going to be wonderful and there'll be a huge celebration. I really love that you touched on mental health, because that's something that I'm a really big proponent of. I talk very openly about my experiences and things like that. And I really, really, as a Kung Fu teacher as well, I mentor a lot of people of different ages, but especially within the AAPI community, it's so stigmatized. And I think it's so important that again is something that we're able to talk about openly and honestly, so that it doesn't become something where people think it's, you're weak because you need therapy, or you're, suck it up kind of thing. Because it's just something for sure. My parents never was like, hey, do you want to try therapy? It was just never on the table. So I really appreciate that you kind of brought that up, knowing yourself, but also that mental health is a real quote unquote thing. Because
it is the thing. But you know what? Look, it took me a long time to get to the point where I was willing to openly admit, like, I'm depressed or I'm having issues. It took me a very long time because, again, the programming that we all have. And believe it or not, my father was a psychiatrist.
Oh, wow.
But in the house, in our traditional Korean house, it's like he left his work at the door. In the house, he was a traditional Korean father. So we never talked about mental health in the house. Ever.
Fascinating.
Yeah, no, I didn't go to therapy until I was an adult.
Yes.
And that was only because I was in a crisis. My father actually was tragically killed by a 16-year-old driver 10 years ago. And so I had gone to therapy on and off before that for different reasons, but that really sent me, to seek it out. But it's funny how it does take time within our culture for people to come around to the importance of really, being open about it if necessary. But here's the thing. It's just like, I kind of wonder from your perspective, because you're a Kung Fu teacher and artist, that is an image where most people on the outside think, oh my God, so tough, right? Because you do Kung Fu, you guys do martial arts. So you're mentally tough, right?
Yeah.
So I bet that must be an even tougher barrier.
Yeah, it was. I love that you keep talking about programming, and I kind of want to keep going down that rabbit hole on how we can undo that programming and what steps, because you've clearly worked so intentionally on it. But as a martial artist, you're right. We have a reputation, but also almost this responsibility to be strong for others, right? And to kind of help uplift others. And then it's like, well, if I'm having things internally, then how can I help other people? And having to kind of come to terms with that. I mean, you're right. I did not even admit to my parents until I was way an adult about therapy. And, this is becoming quite an open podcast, and it's something I share anyway, but, and I wanted this to be more about you, but I, as a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, it's also something that like added to that layer. And it took me a long time to be able to share that, mostly because of my parents and my family. But if it weren't for that dynamic, I think I would have been much more open about it sooner. But because of the whole programming, is what you say, like, it makes you feel like that's something we should suppress and not share to embarrass the household or bring shame. Right. And so, but you're right. As a Kung Fu practitioner and instructor, you have this, this exterior of strength. And I like to tell and teach my students that vulnerability is strength, that being in touch with your feelings is strength. And, crying is okay. Like, it's okay to feel things. And that is, in effect, strength. So I think redefining what that image and word is the most important thing.
Right. Oh, I'm so glad you teach that, because I always say vulnerability is a superpower. Because if you're willing to be open and vulnerable and express yourself in that way, that's a strength. That's admitting, I'm not perfect, but I'm willing to admit it and I'm aware of it. And half the battle is awareness, right? You have to be aware of it. And then the second half of the battle is, doing something about it and trying to like correct it, or like, just deal with it and find ways to kind of get through it. Right? And not ignore it.
Yeah. And so, like I said, I'd love for you, if you don't mind, sharing more, like some of the programming that you kind of felt growing up. And like you said, even until you were older, deciding like, oh, therapy is something I need to do. Are there other examples you have of things that because I feel like every conversation I have, someone hears it and they'll take away that piece, and it could be so instrumental in their journey. And so a lot of Asian Americans, of course, do listen as well. And like, I'm sure they're connecting on so many levels, but were there other things that you felt so programmed about that, you discovered? Give us a shortcut, basically, is what I'm asking.
Yeah. I think one of the things that we all struggle with as Asian Americans is the idea of perfectionism. And so, that's why you have this model minority myth, right? We're supposed to all be successful. We're all supposed to get straight A's and, go to Ivy League colleges, none of which I did, by the way. And so because we have this standard and the bar is placed so high, we feel like we cannot falter. And if we do, then we're a failure, right? And failure's bad. Well, guess what, folks? Once I finally let go of the fact that I didn't have to keep climbing and never stop and never admit like I wasn't having fun or wasn't enjoying myself or whatever, I was miserable because I just was trying to keep up this facade.
Yeah.
And so finally, when I was like, okay, it's okay to fail. And I had to fail a couple times, and sometimes in a big way, like big public failures. It's not fun. I'm certainly not saying like go intentionally fail,
right?
But failure is a part of life, right? Yeah. Everyone does. And sometimes in a very big way. And that does make us stronger. And it makes us smarter, and it makes us more human, right? And so that's the thing. I hate the fact that Asians are looked upon as almost robotic because, we're unemotional and we're detached and all of that, when that's not true. It's just that that's how the world sees us. And that's how we're sort of brought up to a certain extent to kind of like grin and bear it, internalize everything, just keep your head down and just keep moving along. But once I realized I could be open, much more open about my failures and how I pick myself back up and learn from it, because I really do think that everything we go through, good and bad, like I just told you guys, my father was killed pretty violently. That's probably the worst thing that could possibly happen, right? I had to say to myself, I'm going to use this. I'm not going to let his death be in vain. There's something good has to come out of it. And it did, because it made me into a much more sort of sensitive person, empathetic person, knew that loss was something that everyone has to go through, but you have to take something from it and learn from it. So that's part of it for me. I think it's the letting go of the perfection, letting go of that facade, and allowing yourself to feel everything, because life is about feeling everything. You can't go through life, with one emotion or one track and think that you're always going to stay on that track. Sometimes you're going to have to meander a little bit.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And thank you for sharing all of that. And I've also read, of course, and you mentioned that you worked overseas in Tokyo and different parts of Asia. And, I know journalism is journalism, but I'm curious because I've traveled to Asia and everything as well and done some work there. But like, did you find that there were major differences working abroad than like the culture of the United States? And also as like an Asian, but as an Asian American, like what was that dynamic like for you?
Yeah, that's a great question because there are definitely multiple levels to that. But at the most basic, I have 2 dogs, and here's one of my dogs wanting to say hello, and the other one is the one who just barked because she's bigger.
Cameos.
I know. This is what they do. So working as an Asian in Asia, at the surface level, it was great because I look like everyone else. Like I was not somebody who popped out, because that's, kind of what I was used to growing up. So that not being a minority in that way is a very unique experience after you've grown up as a minority, right? So I was never looked upon as anything different, right? So I just was treated as a journalist doing my job. But beneath that, yes, I was Asian American. So I never really completely fit into local culture. So I was never truly Japanese because I'm not, right? And then in Hong Kong, I was still Asian American. I wasn't Hong Kong Chinese, so not a local. And then when I traveled throughout the region, of course, at first they would see an Asian face, but then I would start talking and they would, of course, see my mannerism and my personality. They're like, whoa, she's definitely not a local Asian woman. So, it was an interesting identity for me because I felt like I didn't really fit in anywhere per se, but I did fit in, in terms of not being a minority, like physically. And isn't that the issue here right now? It's like, here in America right now, we're being attacked and, bullied because of what we look like. They have no idea what our background is. They don't know where we're from. And the fact that maybe we've been here for 4 generations and we're more American than maybe like the average white American. But they're just judging us physically. And that's what racism is, isn't it? They don't care what your history is. They don't care what your story is. They're just judging you on your skin color and your eyes. And, and so that's where when you break down racism, it's so freaking stupid. It's so stupid.
There's not a lot of ways to describe it that makes sense, but stupid is great. It's a great term.
Yeah. I mean, I want to, I do swear.
Yeah. It's an open podcast.
And I know
it happened.
You sent me that in the email. You're like,
do I side? How angry am I going to get on this?
I know. And I'm like, oh no, I should probably limit my swearing this time around.
Interview number 2 will come back. We'll do it during like happy
cocktail hour time. There you go.
And then it'll just be it'll be a event fest. And then we can just we'll put the explicit tag on that.
That's right.
So people know.
I know. Because I've sworn a couple of times in my podcast, and because that's the only way I can express myself sometimes. And of course, my mother listens to the podcast all the time. And she's like, "Why do you have to speak that way?" I'm like, "Oh, Mom, really?"
That's so funny. I echo that because I'm like, oh yeah, my mom listens to this. But you know what? I am who I am now, and I'm trying to be a lot more unapologetic about that.
That's good. No, I think that's good. We want to respect our elders and our mothers, but at the same time, they have to let us be the independent women that we've become, right?
Exactly. That's really your own, part of the problem. You did this.
You did this exactly. Blame them. No.
You wanted us to be independent. Well, here you have it. Oh my gosh. I know we're kind of wrapping up because you have so many places to be and a lot to do, but I'd love to hear, kind of a wrap up of like what steps you think communities should be doing, allies can be doing to kind of improve the situation. Because I mean, you've been such an advocate, and I know you're supposed to be taking a break from this, so I apologize.
No.
Since I have another activist on the show, it's pretty exciting to be able to kind of share in that experience. Because when you were talking about burnout and, this is the first time I went to the Capitol in Florida to kind of rally for things, and it has been a lot, right? And I would love to hear, what other ways because people probably ask your advice, like, oh, what can we be doing? We feel so bad, right? Yeah. And I always tell people, like, every action matters, and what actions do you kind of encourage people to do?
Listen, if you don't want to become an activist per se, like publicly, like we're trying to be, or we accidentally became, you don't have to. Don't think like you have to take a huge action to make a difference. When I hear people say, oh, I'm just one person, I can't make a difference. No. Yes, you can. Yes, you can, especially if, you just reach out to somebody. Yeah. My non-Asian friends, I try to tell them, listen, you guys have to understand how much this is affecting us individually, right? And how fearful some of us are, and how some people don't even want to walk down the street anymore. So just the action of calling somebody up, or in the office, your colleague, just ask them how they're doing. Yeah. How are they feeling about what's going on? That tells somebody that you're paying attention and that you care. Right. And that there's some connection that you want to make, as an individual. So things like that, I think people really overlook and sort of think that it doesn't make a difference, but it does. Mm-hmm. When a friend of mine reaches out to me to ask, like, oh man, I just read about this, I'm so sorry. Mm-hmm. That affects me in a positive way, because I'm like, oh, she's paying attention. Yeah. She's actually thinking, she's putting the dots together. She's connecting the dots instead of thinking we're some abstract group, just all the same people. Right. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, makes a huge difference on that personal level. That's an easy thing to do, but it's very, very effective. And then beyond that, of course, it's the education part again. I'm not saying go take a course at USC. Well, if you can,
you could.
Yeah, you could. But I'm saying, but it's so easy now to read a book or an article, or watch a documentary or something that is going to open up, your mind a little bit more and provide a little bit more knowledge that you may never have had. Right. There's so many different ways in which to absorb that kind of information that's not boring. People are like, I don't want to read a book. Okay, then don't read a book. Go watch a movie. Go watch a documentary. Something that's going to at least enhance the experience for you.
Listen to a podcast.
Listen to a podcast. Exactly. So, I just feel like you don't have to change the world overnight. Mm-hmm. Don't think you can, you need to do that. But little by little, if we build that knowledge base, if we make those connections, if we build that allyship, and I know that's a big word that we hear about a lot. Guess what? One of my assignments I do with my students, I have them interview a peer from a different marginalized group, right? So that there's more understanding of, what they have in common, but what their differences are, and where their lack of understanding is. And the students come back going, wow, that was really powerful, because I've actually never sat down with my African-American friend to talk to them about Black-Asian relations, right? And conflict. So things like that,
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like that's starting to become slightly more normalized as there's more solidarity across, the BIPOC community. And I think that is also something we've been programmed to XYZ, like to kind of not ask questions. Is it impolite or, and I always tell people, well, then be polite about it. You can ask questions, just don't be rude. Exactly. I feel like there's so much tension, right? And
there is. Yeah. And I think people are fearful of that. Yeah. And I get it. I'm a journalist and I'm supposed to ask questions, but sometimes you're like, oh boy, is that pushing it too much? Yeah. So, you gotta read the room a little bit too. Right.
Right. And final question, because this process for me, I've been podcasting almost 5 years or so now, and I have learned so much about myself. I am nowhere near like what I would consider to your level of journalism or anything like that. But what I've loved is that's taught me so much about myself, and I've learned so much from others. What would you say, being a broadcast journalist, a host, podcaster, a writer, all of it, like, what do you feel like this whole, like, your career experience? What has it really taught you about yourself?
Wow. I think I'm more brave than I thought I could ever be, especially if I look back on the kind of child I was. I was very much the shy, introverted kid, didn't speak much in class. I socialized a bit, but I was never, a very social kid. Mm-hmm. And so I think I found myself and my voice through my work. And I think part of that came from that sense of justice, because I was treated so unfairly as a kid, and the racism and all of that. I think that really shaped me into becoming this journalist who wanted to seek justice and wanted to seek the truth, wanted to tell stories, wanted to give people who were voiceless a voice. And so this career and this vocation has really taught me a lot about the strength that I have, but also the commitment I have towards righting wrongs. And I think that's why I do this now. I mean, it's kind of funny that I fell into activism, because it really does make sense in terms of the work I do, and the storytelling, the power of storytelling, from a very authentic place. And that's the other thing. I know that I found authenticity in who I am and honesty. And so that's why I just kind of tell it like it is. No BS.
And we love you for that. And so everyone can listen to the May Lee Show, and it's on YouTube as well.
It's on YouTube in video form. And then, of course, on all podcast platforms in audio form. And then I'm very active on social media, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, a little bit of TikTok.
Oh, wow, you're brave. I
know. I started and I wasn't sure. I'm kind of like posting here and there, but I'm certainly not like a crazy TikToker.
All right. Well, I will link that for all of our listeners and viewers here so that they can connect with you and continue. Thank you for your bravery, and thank you for your voice. It is very much appreciated. And May Lee, everybody.
Thank you, Mimi. And you keep doing your great work too.
Thank you. That's all for today's episode. Thanks for listening to The Sifu Mimi Chan Show. Please subscribe and rate my podcast on your platform of choice and leave a review. You can become a patron of the show at patreon.com/SifuMimiChan to help keep this podcast going. Follow me and interact on social media at Sifu Mimi Chan on Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook.